Welcome to the American Reformer Podcast, hosted by Josh Abatoy and Timon Klein. Our mission is to promote a vigorous Christian approach to the cultural challenges of our day, rooted in the rich tradition of Protestant social and political thought.
All right. Hello and welcome back to the American Reformer Podcast. As usual, you've got Josh Abatoy, Executive Director here. I'm joined by Timon Klein, Editor-in-Chief. And today we've got a very special guest, Renn, co-founder of American Reformer and a senior fellow here. Renn, you've no doubt seen him around. You can find him writing on Substack. You can find his print work in many other publications, including, for example, the Wall Street Journal and the Atlantic, and of course, American Reformer. Renn spent years at the Manhattan Institute, and before that, had a career in consulting. Today, we've got Renn joining us to talk about his forthcoming book, which expounds on the articles you've no doubt read about Renn's thesis of the negative world and the three worlds of evangelicalism. Renn, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Timon, well, why don't you go ahead and start teeing us up here a little bit?
Sure. So the book's full title is Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. And this, as Renn expounds in the introduction, and some of the first chapter is building off of the viral article, in every sense of the word viral, article we had at First Things. Would that be, what year was that actually, Renn? I forget now. Was it last year or 2022?
It came out in 2022, almost exactly 2 years ago. Slightly more than 2 years ago it came out. It was in the February 22 issue, but it came out in January, I believe. Gotcha.
Yep. So that that was, again, a very viral article. It's still making the rounds, and it's kind of one of those things where it's successful because when people talk about certain concepts, they can't help but mention it, even if begrudgingly. They have to mention it because it's sort of captured a particular part of the popular evangelical imagination. It's a framework, for those of you that know this, that have read it. It's a framework for analysis, for kind of determining what our situation is based on past developments, but then the book, I mean, the reason you should get the book is most of the book is actually about living in this context and what strategies there are for confronting it, drawing on the good aspects of past strategies for evangelicals to stay relevant, adaptable, so on and so forth. And so that, I mean, I think of in my head as Renn is you said he's a former consultant, Josh, but he's like the consultant for evangelicals now. So it's kind of the function here, but
the unpaid consultant, I might add.
Yes, the volunteer consultant. But Renn, walk us through the kind of, I'm sure you've done this before, but the impetus for the article and then the book, and then we can get into sort of the real meat of it after that.
Sure. The original framework was developed actually in 2014. A friend of mine was doing some consulting work for a think tank that put out a series of 7, I believe it was, like 20-minute short films under the heading of For the Life of the World, after the name of the famous book. Was it Alexander Schmemann, or however you pronounce his name, who made that book? And it was it was a really well done film. It showed on a lot of Christian college campuses. That's where I saw it, at Indiana Wesleyan University here in Indiana. And was really great, well done. And the students loved it. And I was there at the film, watching the film, and I said to myself as I was watching, like, this is really great stuff, but this is the film for 5 years ago. I feel like this is the film that's talking about a world that's rapidly disappearing and will soon go away. It was very much in what I would call the cultural engagement mode, as I've talked about earlier. So I went home and I started knocking out bullet points about what I should, what I thought, and that kind of became the input into the essentially the first version of it. I didn't publish it initially until actually 2017, in my newsletter, which was originally called The Masculinist, I was actually going to shut the newsletter down because it wasn't getting a whole lot of traction. I'd been sort of writing about men's issues in the church, and it was growing, but it didn't hit my metrics. I was going to shut it down. So I'm like, before I shut it down, let me just write my best idea that has nothing to do with men's issues or anything else, and I'll just put it out there, and then, in a month we'll shut it down. So I wrote an article, I think it was issue 13 of the newsletter, called The Lost Worlds of Evangelicalism. And somebody sent it to Rod Dreher, and that actual article went viral at the time. I mean, the original version went viral. And Doug Wilson wrote about it. Other people wrote about it. Somebody told me that part of it was read from the pulpit at Redeemer Presbyterian Church's East Side campus in New York. And so I got thousands of new subscribers off of that, which is basically, so this article is the only reason basically I kept writing on this topic. And then in 21, First Things Magazine, at the suggestion of James Wood, asked me to update that and create a version for their magazine, which I did, and it turned into a mega viral hit for them. And then, of course, I turned it into a book. And so it's something that's been out there for a while as an idea that I've had, and I'm glad to be able to bring it out in the form of a book. But it's a framework is only part of it. It's about a quarter of the book, and then 3/4 of the book is about what we should do about where we find ourselves today.
Right. So the getting to the book itself, with that background in mind, part one is basically that, the descriptive kind of framework for negative world. The part is called Welcome to Negative World. The first chapter is kind of expanding on the article itself, and then you add some more in the second and third chapters. And the three strategies that you're kind of looking back on for positive and neutral world are the culture warriors, seeker sensitive people, and the cultural engagers, which is, I think people shorthand might say, Kellerism or something like that. Can you briefly just describe for people those the kind of distinctives of those three styles of now largely outdated engagement, even though you pull from them a little bit as you move on?
Yeah, this isn't necessarily in the book, but in retrospect, thinking about it, um, evangelicalism, as we understand it today, is to some extent a product of the decline of Christianity in America. If you go back to the old 50s sort of Protestant consensus, generic Christian consensus in America, it was really very mainline oriented. And, the kind of the main line started going into decline. And it was really, the main line couldn't reverse decline. The sort of fundamentalists weren't really able to break out of their ghetto of sort of backwoods Christianity. And then it really, evangelicalism sort of filled the void that was coming there, with things like the Jesus movement, et cetera, which, I don't talk a whole lot about, which I really see feeding into seeker sensitivity. And so essentially, these three tribes are all developed, these three strategies were all developed as a response to decline, essentially. So the culture war people, that came out of the 1970s, and of course, especially in the 80s and early 90s, with the religious right. This was a group of people who saw Christianity in decline, saw the moral fabric of America decaying, and they decided to mobilize politically to fight and take back the country. And of course, that fight against secular culture mindset, that sort of theme, that sort of strategy, if you will, is still very much alive and well in America. And so that was a product of the positive world. Seeker sensitivity was a second product of the positive world, where people like Bill Hybels sort of did a business school approach where they did a market survey. He did market research. He asked people why they didn't go to church. He got an earful, as he said, and he designed a church to appeal to people who were not going to church anymore. So it was like, let's lower the barriers to church by getting rid of these denominations, getting rid of stodgy hymns, being informal, sort of contemporary music, sort of theater seating, topical therapeutic sermons, etc. And this is the suburban non-denominational megachurch that we all know, which in some respects is mainstream Christianity, which wasn't necessarily hyper-political, but definitely was Republican aligned, I would say. And then,
Well, Aaron, on that one, real quick, I mean, would you also, just to sort of fill it out, I think of Rick Warren as embodying the same kind
yeah,
of model. I mean, he wrote as much, right? Like looking at the, who's the guy that makes 200K,
yeah,
has 2.5 kids, whatever. But then there's also a sense in which even Mark Driscoll kind of, for his own demographic, embodied that model, I would say.
yeah. Driscoll's really an interesting one. Maybe we can come back to Driscoll if you want to talk about him a little bit, because I do think he's kind of unique. Um, but um, but yeah, so to me, like Bill Hybels at Willow Creek in suburban Chicago and Rick Warren at Saddleback in Southern California are the two paradigms of the seeker sensitive movement, and both of them very heavily catered to emerging baby boomer suburbia. The boomers were really the demographic heartland of this, whereas culture war was always a little more backwoods, if you will, much more lesser educated, lower economic status, et cetera. And you would think of people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson following that. When we hit the neutral world, we entered we got a third version that I call cultural engagement, which again, I think you can think of cultural engagement a couple ways. One is what you just said of Driscoll. It's a seeker sensitivity for the cities. It's, rather than baby boomer suburbia, it's sort of the new urbanites, the people who are moving back into, for example, post Giuliani New York, where crime is down. It's now where it's like TV shows like Friends or Seinfeld. The city's cool again. Highly educated people, young, hip, intellectual, artistic, at least in their own mind, and serving that. So that would be one way to think of it. The other way to think of it is sort of the opposite of the culture war. Rather than fighting with people all the time, they wanted to take advantage of this sort of what the neutral world, which was more, Christianity was another positive towards a culture, wasn't really negative yet. It was sort of a pluralistic public square. It's like, let's take advantage of that, sit down and talk to people. And so I really think Tim Keller is sort of the architect of that strategy, although he started kind of really before the cities came back in sort of old New York. But then, 5 years in, Giuliani became mayor and it was a radical change of environment there. I think Driscoll, just briefly on Driscoll, he was kind of interesting in that, he was sort of cultural engaging in that he was big city. He was, all about the arts. They were very into doing their own bespoke music, super high production values, tech savvy. They were early to podcasting and video casting, which is one reason they got big. He was super media savvy, telegenic, master of sort of internet, web 1.0, if you want to call it that. But he was also very brash and very much of a provocateur, kind of in your face, a little bit polarizing. So he did channel a little bit of the culture war as well. I mean, he was really a unique guy. There aren't too many people like him, but he was in fact very, very successful. And also interesting that he was Gen X, whereas the other people I mentioned are predominantly boomers or pre-boomers.
Where would you situate someone like C.J. Mahaney and his, because it overlaps with Driscoll's time. I mean, that's when the Gospel Coalition was forming, but Mahaney had some similar aspects of that model, it would seem, but in a totally different, not totally different, but a different environment. And he himself was not Gen X.
Yeah, I don't really know that much about C.J. Mahaney, to be honest, so I can't really situate him. I'm really not super familiar with him.
No, that's totally fine. I think it's at least in the viral podcast about all that he came up quite a bit.
I think these are kind of like these are sort of like three sort of general thrusts, and I do think you can kind of combine these sort of elements in different ways and it does not account for everyone. So, for example, I do think there are people who you would declare say are evangelical who don't fall into these categories. So you might think of the new monastics, for example, the neo Anabaptists. I see them as being they do have some things that are somewhat cultural engagey, but I think they're very distinct in their own way. So you can always go through and just name people. Where do you think where do they place? You took somebody like Jeff Vanderstelten Missional Church. I would definitely put that in cultural engagement. for example. And that was another sort of Puget Sound movement.
Mm-hmm. Well, you don't fully adopt, but you mentioned the breakdown between, left, right, and neo-Anabaptist, or the other. This is James Davis and
Yeah.
Hunter, and I don't know if you mentioned Niebuhr at that point or not. I can't remember, but as another breakdown, where the point is that neo-Anabaptists are kind of their own distinct thing that may be pulling or fit into the models less comfortably,
Right.
but they are kind of doing that.
Well, they're definitely, that
yeah.
was James Davis and Hunter and To Change the World. He sort of divided modern American Christianity into the Christian right, the Christian left, and the neo-Anabaptist. And he's got some very good descriptions of the neo-Anabaptists. And they are undoubtedly relentlessly on the left. In fact, they are the most aggressively leftist of all of them, I would think. Although a lot of those, again, a lot of the new monastic guys have unbelievable skin in the game in terms of, how they were personally living their life as well. There was this guy I met, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. I hope it's Wilson Hartgrove, not Hartgrove Wilson. When I met him, like the guy would like go on and on and on about Alec and the Koch brothers and all this stuff and just rampaging about them. And he had led his own sort of private peace mission to Iraq during the first Gulf War. Okay. So that'll give you a sense of where he's coming from. But he was also living in an intentional community in a Black neighborhood in Durham, North Carolina, where like half of the people that lived in this house that they created were essentially, homeless ex-offenders or people of that nature. And they were trying to create, again, intentional community around that, very much in that mode. And he attended there's a lot I could go on there, but I mean, he had a lot of skin in the game, definitely left, but had a lot of skin in the game and very congruent in his beliefs.
Yeah. And there's a sense in which all these groups, including perhaps especially even neo-Anabaptist leanings politically, you could describe many evangelicals lately, much more lately, more obviously taking a sort of historically Anabaptist approach to a lot of politics. But there's a sense in which these approaches to decline from evangelicals, and you describe a strength actually of evangelicalism being its adaptability. We can come back to that in a minute, but each of the approaches or responses to decline have something commendable about them, but something that is not recommendable, that has not been successful, and that's where you move into the negative world strategies.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe briefly say, because you do this at the end of part one, what is the benefit of adopting certain pieces of each one, but the rest of it being non-transferable?
Sure. Well, I think there are different things that we can recognize that certain of these people got right, in a sense. For example, the seeker-sensitive movement. And I think there's a lot of this that flowed into some of the culture engagement people like Keller as well, was this idea of let's not put any artificial, man-made, extra-biblical barriers between people and the gospel. Okay? Let's not, if we're going to have somebody turned off on the gospel, let it be because they're offended by the gospel itself, not because they don't like our choir robes and our 16th century hymns. Okay. So there is this sense of, hey, we want to have, something that is, designed to bring people to Jesus first and then bring some of these other things maybe later. Again, I think the culture war people, understood that sometimes you have to be willing to be unpopular. There's just, you're not going to be able to square the circle on popularity. And again, I think the cultural engager people, had much more of an appreciation for the life of the mind as well, the arts, things of that nature. Saw more value in vocation, perhaps. The faith and work movement really came out of that. So I think there are things you can look at this and say, they did, they did some interesting things. And I'm not saying you just take the best and bam, there's your solution. I think with the part of it is like any approach that you take is only going to be partially correct at best. And you're going to have, some strengths and some weaknesses. That's why I'm not as negative on, people like to bemoan the divisions in the church. And yes, the church shouldn't be divided. At the same time, I think kind of the different denominations have different gifts almost like different gifts of the Spirit, and they're better at certain things. And, I think ultimately that will end up reconciled, but not everybody's good at the same thing.
Right. Okay, so just to circle back to the adaptation question, because that's what all these strategies again are reactive in a certain sense to decline. You make very clear in the book. I think you've said this recently in a podcast that maybe you didn't make it as clear in the initial article, but it is clear in the book that by the 50s, even as we're sort of enshrining in God we trust, we have I guess the first president to convert to Christianity in office, Presbyterian actually. It is still a situation of decline by the 50s. And in some of the initial thoughts I threw out there on American Reformer, I was using Winthrop Hudson's analysis, and he's writing in 1960 and says the decline started in 1914. So it'd be 100 years before negative world enters.
Right.
The decline actually starts, which makes sense. But this idea of adaptation as being an actual strength of evangelicalism, I think you put it somewhere like that, is something that might be worth interrogating or might be questionable to some readers. Is that actually a strength, or does the adaptive kind of mood necessarily entail that any strategy will be an ultimate failure, as you say, because you're you're on defense all the time?
Well, yeah, I do think when you're constantly in adaptation mode, there's strengths and weaknesses out of everything. The strength is that you're able to, again, to adapt to better to changing times, almost by definition. The downside is you're not as rooted, you're not as permanent. You get blown here and there by the wind a little bit. The stuff you build and create tends to decay very quickly. The half-life of an evangelical church is probably pretty short, in comparison to some of these mainline churches that have been around, 150, 200 years in some cases. So there is a sense in which if you don't, the downside is you end up syncretizing with the culture. The stuff you do doesn't last very long. But if your failures to adapt come with their own consequences as well. And one of the things we see in, for example, in say a country like Brazil and Latin America, is that the incumbent Roman Catholic Church really has been much less successful at adapting than evangelicalism, which is why much of Latin America is becoming evangelical rather than Roman Catholic, because the evangelicals have a message that's more resonating with the people.
Which is kind of historically odd, because historically you could describe, at least in the medieval period, as Catholicism being highly adaptable, and that was one of its strengths. I mean, you see this in, of course, among the Britons and the Irish, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
but
and I think they've always been good. They've certainly been good in kind of a missionary context. The other thing, what often happens in the kind of what's happened historically, I think, in the Catholic world is there's some kind of an innovator, and the innovator is kind of a renegade, not very popular with the establishment, but then the renegades are eventually sort of institutionalized and tamed over the generation, which is how all these orders, like the Dominicans and the Franciscans, got started, right? It's like Francis is this kind of wild man, and then it's like it's contained, the Franciscan movement, if you will, of their kind of giftings are contained within Catholicism. Whereas in Protestantism, there would just be a split. It would be a schism and a sect breaking out off of that, sometimes of questionable orthodoxy. But yeah, but definitely there's definitely track record. And I think, like, for example, I do think there's much more of a charismatic Catholicism now in South America, as they realize, we got to compete with the Pentecostals.
Right. And even that kind of move with the preaching orders, we might say, the Dominicans, Franciscans, was, it was a function of the hierarchy that's inherent in Catholicism, because those were given permission from the Pope to go into any jurisdiction and preach and kind of shake things up. And there was lots of conflict, from the local bishops frothing kind of against that, because it was a violation of jurisdiction. Right. But when you have that hierarchy being sort of demanded, it changes things much more rapidly than a more decentralized, non-hierarchical scenario.
Right. And
Anyway,
you could even go back
yeah.
to, the original sort of monastic movements and the Desert Fathers, people just going off and becoming
Mhm.
ascetics and things like that. And it was sort of contained within the church. It wasn't
Yeah.
just, it wasn't there. And that's one thing that, Protestantism, it's like you leave and go start a startup, right? You start your own
Hmm.
startup. You don't necessarily, it's institutionally weak, certainly evangelicalism in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's always, I quoted in the piece I wrote a funny kind of, I think it was in a sermon actually from Henry Emerson Fosdick, like late in the 30s. It was like, oh, maybe we accommodated too much, which was like a little late in the game for him to do that. But maybe we've gone too far. So there's always that. And that was for the main line, which had then essentially become community churches with no distinctives whatsoever, with these kind of agreements that Anglicans over here and Presbyterians over here, you take care of that geographic area. But anyway, okay, Josh, anything to chime in on there before we move on to strategic analysis? Now that we've beat up negative world in a probably totally nonsensical
Yeah,
approach, but
yeah.
uh,
No, one question, Aaron, and I think I've seen this in some of the critical engagements with your periodization and argumentation, but how would you respond to the line of argumentation that basically says the fundamentalist battles between the fundamentalists and the liberals in the 1920s, in some senses, represented the start of negative world, in the sense that this represented a time where um, Christians who held to some sort of historical distinctives, like around the inerrancy of Scripture, or the miraculous nature of Jesus's life, like the virgin birth and resurrection and such, um, and especially the evolution versus creationism debate. The fundamentalists sort of had to leave the public square in the 20s, and there were of course splits in a lot of the main lines. So how do how would you, I guess, respond to a line of argumentation that would say it's been negative world for the really rigorous Christians for 100 years?
Yeah, well, first, what I always say is if you don't find the framework compelling and it's not useful for you, don't use it. I'm not trying to cram this down anybody's throat or pretend that it's the uh, one true lens on which to understand history. And I would certainly say it's probably doesn't answer every question. It's it's not again designed to capture every nuance. It's designed to help understand, make people make sense of what they've seen in the world, like in their own life, uh, in a lot of ways. To me, it's sort of like the way that we divide. We say we divide history into sort of ancient, medieval, and modern. That sort of tripartite division, man, that misses a lot. It's not useful for a lot of things, but we keep coming back to it because there's a certain utility there in it, I think, and so I never really, to me, like the fundamentalist monetarist controversy. Once you get back prior to say 1964, which is where I sort of begin my three worlds, sort of the once the kind of Protestant Christian consensus really cracked up, the old Protestant establishment collapsed in America, for example. That world is different than the world before. So if you want to go back and look at Christianity in American history, writ large, there's a lot of things going on there, right? There was, old light, old side, new side. There was the Civil War. I mean, there were tons of divisions going back all the way. And one of the things I would just say, though, about like fundamentalist modernist controversy is, the modernists certainly claimed the label of Christian. They certainly they viewed their Christianity really as maybe the more authentic version of Christianity, and whatever we might think of that, they were not trying to essentially kick Christianity out of the public square or anything like that, because they were all, many of them were Protestant ministers themselves, and so I think that is really you know where I would go with that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's compelling to me about the framework, and again, I mean, I like that response a lot. It's very similar to I saw Michael Anton write recently at the beginning of a piece that people had been complaining he writes too long, and he was like, "Look, no one's got a gun to your head. You don't have to read it," which I thought was a great response. Um, but in this, I mean, in one sense, there is this conflict could be described over time that's playing out as a rural urban divide, and Protestants trying to grapple with that, and it's with certain changes in immigration, and specifically Catholic immigration, that which consolidates in urban centers, and Protestantism had always been somewhat rural. That it begins to change this dynamic very rapidly, especially in the late 19th century into the 20th century. And then you see the sort of crescendo is getting your first Catholic president, which I think is basically where you're kind of dating it.
Right.
So if nothing else, it's the nail is in the coffin more or less at that point that you begin. So there's lots of prior causality that goes into it, but of course this is a watershed
Yeah.
moment that really signals something very different going on.
Yeah. And one thing I would say, that I don't put this in the book because I'm not interested in really picking fights with our Catholic friends. But the reality is, part of the deinstitutionalization of Christianity in America was, at the behest of Catholics. Ultimately,
Exactly right.
Catholics played an enormous and, in some respects, decisive role in undermining Christianity in America.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't like prayer in schools because they thought the prayers were too Protestant. They didn't like the
Mm-hmm.
use of the King James Bible,
Mm-hmm.
for example.
Mm-hmm.
They're very sectarian, and so I don't pretend to be the deepest expert on that, but this is one of the things that, like, when you start looking at history, you start missing out on these things. That, like, look, the Catholics were great critics of the Protestant establishment, and
Mm-hmm.
say, unlike Jews, who also had their own kind of criticisms of that, but were numerically very small outside of, say, New York City. There were unbelievable large number of Catholics.
Mm-hmm.
And so that became a major demographic block, as well as I always say, it's like, every time you read a book, talking about, like, trying to cite the kind of where it all went wrong in America and such in something internal to kind of the Protestant establishment, and that it's almost invariably written by someone who is not themselves Protestant,
Yes.
and
Yes.
and who is overlooking the issues that their own particular group, the role they played in how we got to now.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I brought basically this point up in the piece I wrote, which was, the Catholics introduce pluralism, more or less, which is something all the post-liberal Catholics froth against now. But they essentially institutionalized it. They came in and were like, it's bigoted that your public schools are coded for Protestantism. And then once they won those battles, they were like, just kidding, we don't want to go to those schools anyway. We're going to start our own things, after they had already gotten the Bible out of it, whatever. Anyway, I think that's something that should be explored further, of how this happened, and the urban centers were able to sort of push those developments because it's where power has often been concentrated, and it's where Catholics happen to congregate. They did not become rural as many other Protestants were. So
Yeah, I
anyway,
think I got to
yeah.
I know we're going to be limited for time, but I think there's like a lot of, once you start looking at the Catholic Protestant lens and things like that, you start thinking about a lot of different things, and like, what is the role that this played? For example, in something like Roe versus Wade, where there's concern, in certain quarters, even at those late dates, around Catholics not using birth control and having lots of kids, or
Mm-hmm.
about busing, in
Mm-hmm.
Boston, school busing in Boston, which was sort of the WASP's revenge against the Irish ethnics who'd taken, when was it James Michael Curley took over the city?
Mm-hmm.
There's a great paper by economist like Glazer, The Curley Effect. He deliberately made things horrible for the WASPs in order to encourage them to leave and solidify his control over the city. Well, then, the WASP, through busing, essentially destroyed those Irish neighborhoods in Boston. There was some payback there. And so, you should always, when you're looking at American history, these sort of social class, religion, ethnic boundaries like are so important in understanding. Not saying that they make that everything comes down to that, but it's a little extra lens on how to think about these things that no one ever mentions.
Right. Moral of the story is everyone can just go watch Gangs of New York and you understand American history after that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the thing I love about Gangs of New York, as one of my friends pointed out, is Boss Tweed is essentially the good guy.
Right.
Boss Tweed is progress, basically.
Yes. Yeah. Anyway, because we do want to moderate our time here. To get to the rest of the book, Aaron. So we've kind of circled around, the explanation for how we got here, the background, but then as you said, 3/4 of the book is getting down to brass tacks and kind of providing some advice on how to conduct yourself as essentially a moral minority at this point. You don't have cultural control. You no longer kind of set the rules of the game. So you've got to play in a new environment, which is negative world. So break down for us just briefly, kind of where you take it at that point.
Well, I have 3 sections on the future which deal with which you might call the personal, the institutional, and the missional. So how should we live as individuals and as families? How should our churches and other institutions, including things like businesses, function? And then how should we do mission? And what I would say is, here's what I would just say is general themes that we should be thinking about for the negative world. Theme 1 is exploration. And I make this point before I even really get into it, which is, a guy like Bill Hybels could sort of do traditional market research and kind of design a church to, reach an underserved market niche. I don't think we're not going to be able to come up with the 50-point plan, okay, for the negative world. We're in an uncertain, unprecedented, rapidly changing environment. And therefore, we're sort of like the explorers going into the unknown. We have to be able to walk more by faith than by sight. And recognize that a lot of what we try isn't going to work. And we're going to need a lot of people out there experimenting. And so I think the exploration mindset is important. The example I use is the Hebrews crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land. This was a generation that had known only the desert. That was their only experience of life. They had to cross into the unknown of the land of Canaan. And there's a line in Joshua where it says, "Follow the ark because you have not been this way before." And that's us. We have not been this way before. So that's theme 1, exploration. Theme 2 is counterculture. And here, this was a great suggestion of my editor, by the way, that he suggested I engage with Tim Keller's book, Center Church. And in Center Church, Keller puts his own spin on H. Richard Niebuhr's Christ and Culture model. And so my 3 worlds model is about how the world views the church. The Christ and Culture model was about how the church views the world, basically. And Keller came up with he reduced it to essentially, Niebuhr has 5 styles. He has 4 that he labels: transformation, relevance, counterculture, and 2 kingdoms. Transformation is where Keller puts culture war, in that they want to transform the country via politics to inaugurate a more godly society. I think that Keller and the culture engagers had a bit of transformational emphasis as well. The second is relevance, which I think is kind of self-explanatory. The seeker-sensitives are clearly relevance. I classify the cultural engagers also as primarily relevance, but also sometimes with transformational aspirations. I think as Keller wanted to transform the city. And the 2 kingdoms would be like our Lutheran things. Put them aside for the minute because they're not big. But counterculture is his kind of encapsulation of the Christ against culture model, where the church exists primarily to be, a community apart from the world. So you would put the Amish in counterculture. You would put the kind of new monastics, and the neo-Anabaptist, into the counterculture model. Any kind of intentional community, the Bruderhof, you would say, is very counterculture. And so what I suggest is not that we want to become the Amish, okay, or that we forget about, being relevant, or we forget about transformation, or forget about other things, but there needs to be a shift in emphasis away from transformation and relevance towards counterculture. That is to say, we need to strengthen our own communities, self-consciously steward the strength of our own communities in ways that we did not have to do previously. So sort of theme 1 would be exploration. Theme 2 would be counterculture. Theme 3, which is, it's really part of counterculture, but I want to label it separately, is what I call minority mindset. If you're a minority, you need to start acting like a minority. Minorities in the US have always behaved very differently from the majority culture. And I think we need to start taking some lessons from them and how to, again, primarily to strengthen and sustain our own community. And I actually use early 20th century Catholicism as an example of what to do there. And then the fourth is something that I would say is, I don't know if there's like a pithy label for it. You might call it like high bar Christianity. I was really struck by when I was reading Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. He has this thing called the dilemma of renunciation. So in the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, there was basically this high bar for what it meant to live as a saint. And the Catholic Church realized that this was not attainable to the average man. So really only the monks and the priests and people of that nature, the super Christians, could really be expected to live out the full Christian ethics. Everybody else was sort of just along for the ride. It was sort of a two-speed Christianity. The Reformation rejected two-speed Christianity and said we need to have single-speed Christianity. And so the result of a single-speed Christianity or single-level Christianity is that you have to lower the bar so that everybody can clear it, because you can't make everyone live like a monk if you have to reach all of society. And so the dilemma of renunciation is, if you want to set a high bar, you have to be somewhat tolerant of a two-speed Christianity. If you want to have a one-speed Christianity, you must have a lower bar, basically, for what you demand of people. You can't demand that they renounce too much of this life. And so I sort of apply that to the situation of Christianity in America, Protestantism in America. In the 1950s, where we're sort of a Protestant normative society and it's sort of expected that people go to church, the church has to have a very low bar. You basically have to have a place in the pews for anyone who shows up. And as you move into a negative world where the idea that everyone's going to be Christianity is increasingly going to be for the minority, I think we can say, great. Do we need to have a sort of a least common denominator church like the seeker sensitives had or like the cultural engagers had? Or can we say, hey, maybe we should be a lot more like the New Testament church, where there was a very high standard, and we're understanding that the majority of people are not going to be Christian, and therefore we can say you are expected to actually live out the Christian life in something of its fullness, in a way that we could never say before, when Christianity was sort of the default civil religion of America. So that's sort of another theme that I think about.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and Josh probably has his own thoughts as well. The one thread I just wanted to pull briefly that I thought was most compelling is sort of that I think would be most effective for a lot of Christians to adopt is the sort of minority mentality, right? And you see as you mentioned, minorities, whatever kind of minority. There's several movements in American history, recent history, they operate very differently, but they're also maximally effective, and that's for various reasons. I mean, in some cases, it's tapping into certain pathologies that are actually designed for Christianity's demise, but they tap into them. And you see this like with the gay lobby, right? I mean, so one analog to this could be, there's certain people kind of running from a label of Christian nationalism right now, right? We can adjudicate whether it's a good label or not later, but you're running from it. Whereas if you were the gay lobby 30 years ago, you just lean into all of it, right? And you can sort of expand on it and amend it later, but the pride sort of theme is very, very strong. And you just say, we're going to be everything you think we are. Right. And we're gonna parade through the streets, right? And this has been, for various reasons, very effective, but it is a totally different mentality than the ones that a lot of Christians adopt right now.
Yeah, the challenge, and this is one reason I use early 20th century Catholicism a little bit as an example. I think when you start looking at other minorities and what they've done, what you often see, and especially like racial minorities or the thing, or essentially people who are gay, they have a degree of community solidarity that evangelicals are never going to have, because basically you can't defect. If you're, essentially if you're gay in the early 1990s, it's not like you can just, I'll just get away from all the negative, way people think about gays by just becoming straight. It wasn't going to happen. And so, similarly, one of the things people criticize my three worlds model for, which I think is ridiculous, is this idea that, it wasn't a positive world for Black Americans in the 1950s. I can tell you that. Yeah, but you know what? They weren't being treated poorly because they were Christian. They were being treated poorly because they were Black. And there was no getting out of that. And so groups that have essentially externally enforced solidarity have the ability to do certain things. It's harder for evangelicals to pull off because it's very easy to essentially defect, which is what, for example, and you could even defect without shedding the label, which someone like David French has done, for example. There are so many ways to essentially get out from underneath the spotlight that I think it makes it very, very difficult to come up with things. Now, what I would say is definitely, at the individual church level, the individual community level, leaning into what makes you different, I think, into your actual distinctives and your core beliefs, is something that I think is very powerful. And again, even Tom Holland has talked about that, where he said, "Look, Christianity needs to lean into the weird stuff, the demonic and like miracles, and so there is something to that. I think there is something to that. It's just harder to implement as a community-wide strategy because it's very easy to defect from evangelicalism."
Right. And part of that's because it's not, the defections aren't ruthlessly punished. So David French is allowed to sort of straddle the line, or have a foot in each boat, and there's still some of his defenders, and he can kind of do this in a possible future. That's simply not allowed, and the in group would punish him ruthlessly for any kind of defection. But that's obviously not a reality now. The weirdness, kind of leaning into the weirdness, which I think is, like you said, there's a lot to that, and you see you see defections from evangelicalism because they don't do that fast enough, and that's why you have everyone going, Eastern Orthodox or something, because it's the weirdness now. You get to kind of hop into that and be countercultural immediately. So evangelicalism is kind of bleeding on all fronts in that sense. But Josh, as we wrap up on this, because I know we're tight on time here.
Hey, can I just add one more point on that?
Yeah, for sure.
Part of it is like there's very little value to being a part of the average evangelical church. So even if you suffer ostracism, you really lose nothing. You just go down to the church down the street and join that one.
Yeah.
And so you have to have something of value that people fear losing.
Perfect segue to my question, Aaron, which was going to be on institutional engagement. How do these insights then apply on the institutional level as evangelicals think about engaging with existing institutions, shoring up their own, and founding new ones? Can you talk through a little bit about how that strategy unpacks?
Sure. I sort of take an opportunistic or triage strategy when it comes to institutions. Some institutions you can't avoid, like the IRS. But I sort of look at, are there institutions that are doing the right thing, moving in the right direction with leaders that are trying to improve things? Great, I'll probably support that institution. Are there ones that are going in the wrong direction? I'm probably going to not support it. One of the things I do believe is that minority mindset means that you become less invested in the mainstream institution society, like the military. To me, if you're a conservative young man, or you have a son who's military age, whether or not you should go in the military should be a completely transactional decision. Might be good for some people to make some college money, or maybe it'll help them get shaped up or whatever. This idea that you're just going to be like, I'm going to be patriotic, serve my country, like you're being a chump if you're doing that. And so I think, yeah, we need to check out, like we're checking out of the public schools. Public schools are really important. I'm not entirely giving up on public schools per se, but like, it looks like a really hard problem. And I don't think that we should feel any obligation to stay invested in institutions that are not aligned with our values and often hostile to us, And the reality is like, we need to be willing to say to people, yes, there are legitimate problems in the country, but those are your problems. They're not our problems. They're your problems. Homelessness in San Francisco is your problem. Okay. And yeah, if you're like the Catholic Church in San Francisco, of course you're going to be trying to like serve the homeless. If you're there, you're not going to ignore that. But this idea that like, oh, we need to be trying to like get structures of society to reorient toward these problems, when the problem is the people who are running San Francisco. That's the problem, right? In California, and it's their problem. It's not our problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I had my father-in-law actually was very early to this on the military point, because I intended to go JAG when I was in law school, and he is a naval veteran and Annapolis grad, talked me out of it for this exact reason, which is, all of us can lament the fact that a generation ago, the patriotic impulse expressed that way was still somewhat legitimate. You weren't participating in an institution that's dysfunctional and basically hates you, but that's just changed, and that's part of the playing out of the negative world. So I think we can call it the exit in some sense is advisable insofar as people can do it. I think people are increasingly adopting that view, it seems to me, at least with schooling. Okay, parting thoughts real quick then before we hop off here. Josh, anything else, and then we'll let Aaron have the last word here.
Yeah, I think just going to his military and public school point, I think that we're already seeing a little bit of this, which is sort of like a cascading, I guess I'd say cascading lack of confidence in a lot of mainstream institutions. And so I think, this falls to us. And I know, American Reformer as an institution is working on several fronts to provide solutions. But I think to those of us who are evangelical and situated to do so, it falls to us to start, creating those alternative institutions. And, of course, those take time. They require legitimacy and credibility and a track record. But the hour is late, I think, in getting some of those institutions stood up. And, Aaron, really appreciate your work on this front. And I think sounding the alarm in some ways that we really do need to get disruptive and entrepreneurial with our own community and our own institutions really now.
Right. And well, thank you. And I think this bit about minority mindset, it'll be interesting to see what generates the most controversy in the book. But I certainly think that adopting the minority mindset will be harshly and bitterly opposed by significant segments of evangelical leadership. And you hear a lot of talk, for example, today around the common good, for example. Everybody likes to talk about the common good. Rhetoric around the common good is one of the ways that they try to manipulate you into staying invested in these institutions and staying invested in these things. And so I think we have to be, there's going to be a lot of gaslighting going on and things of that nature. But the reality is, again, I'm heavily influenced by, kind of my reading of, Paul's letters in the New Testament. He was not, he was like, yes, pay taxes to whom taxes are due, give honor to the king, do all that stuff. We should be doing that. We should be paying our taxes. We should be carrying out our obligations to society. At the same time, the early church was not about propping up the institutions of the Roman Imperium, okay, which were, in many ways, evil institutions. And, that was I think the famous last paragraph, or maybe infamous last paragraph of Alistair McIntyre's book After Virtue, that inspired Rodrier's Benedict option, was this idea that, I can't quote it exactly, but it's something like, men of goodwill decided to turn aside from, propping up the remains of the Roman Imperium in favor of building something new. They turned their back on that and built something new. And of course, he hated the Benedict option. I think he regrets ever writing that paragraph. But I think that paragraph, read the last paragraph of Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue. And I think it's a tremendous guide to how we ought to be thinking in this world.
Yeah. I'm reminded of Robert Louis Wilkins' book, whatever it is, on the early church, where he just talks about, from the beginning. I mean, the Christians, they're not just kind of floating around. I mean, they're already creating calendars and their own burial rituals and all these sort of, foundational elements of culture that then spring forward once, especially at the collapse of the empire later, to build something new. So anyway, Aaron, thanks so much for coming on to talk to us about this book. I'm sure it's going to generate a ton more discussion, even more after than it did after your first article. But now everyone's going to be talking about the book. So thanks for coming to us relatively first, and we appreciate all your work. And I'm sure we'll have to have you on for a debrief at some point once it's been out there for a while.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me on.
All right, everybody, subscribe to AmericanReformer.org for the articles and content, also this podcast, and follow us on Twitter at AmReformer. And until next time, have a good one.
You can find American Reformer on the internet at www.AmericanReformer.org or on X.com, formerly Twitter, at AmReformer. Don't forget to like, rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. Please consider supporting us today by making a tax-deductible donation through our secure online donation portal at AmericanReformer.org. That's AmericanReformer.org.